If one of your goals is to improve the health or mobility of your shoulder, one thing we want to keep in mind is that your shoulder is a ball and socket joint. So if you imagine that you're holding a metal ball and socket joint, which has the ability to spin and move kind of up and down and side to side, and has all of these different motions or degrees of freedom, if you took that ball and socket joint and you then wrapped it in a really tight layer of saran wrap, you can imagine how moving that ball in the socket in any direction would then become restricted. So one of the things that we talk about with our ball and socket joints is that we often want to deal with the deeper layers, like the saran wrap, to make sure that that's not limiting us, before just looking at the outer layers, or if you think of it like the layer of an onion, dealing with more of the peel. We want to deal with the inside stuff too. And sometimes we need to deal with the inside stuff first, because that's what's limiting us. And that often is the case, but I'm not going to say that it's always the case. So if you have a glaring deficiency in internal or external rotation, but you also want to improve something like shoulder flexion, you may want to make sure that you're funneling some effort towards the internal and external rotation, because that's going to deal with the deep layers. Whereas dealing with shoulder flexion, you're going to be dealing with more the external or the more superficial or the outer layers, outer tissues, outer muscles, however you want to think of it. And if you just deal with the outer stuff while you have an inner problem, often you'll hit a plateau where it just does not get any better until you address the inner stuff. So just keep that in mind. The layer of the saran wrap in this context or in this scenario is actually things like your joint capsule and just the deep rotators of your shoulder. So we want to make sure that the deep capsule, that those deep rotators and all that is healthy, and that your ball is free to move in and around the socket. And then we can start looking at more and more outer layers, or just funneling more and more of our time to dealing with the more linear based motions or outer layers of that joint. The other thing to keep in mind with your shoulder is that because it's a ball and socket joint, you have two bones. Sometimes we just focus on the one bone and we totally forget about the other one. However, it's the socket, which is made up by your shoulder blade or your scapula, that dictates the position of the joint. And so we need your shoulder blade to be able to move freely on your rib cage and fully on your rib cage to set the shoulder up for success and to be able to move the way your shoulder should be able to move. So sometimes we'll run into scenarios where we have a shoulder problem or we have pain in the shoulder, but that may be because we actually have a scapular shoulder blade problem, in that that shoulder blade cannot move freely or fully on the rib cage. So we want to be mindful of this with every joint. The pain is not always where the problem is. We can also take that one step further. Your shoulder blade lives on your rib cage, so it should be able to freely move on the rib cage. But if you don't have a rib cage that moves or a rib cage that can expand where it needs to, then we might be running into problems there too. So you should be getting a sense at this point of how everything is connected, and it's not always just isolated things that are happening. So when it comes to having a healthy shoulder, you want to make sure that your shoulder blade is looked after and that you've got a rib cage that can move well and can expand where it needs to expand, including in the front, in the side, and in the back on both sides. This is where you'll really start to see problems, especially in those people that are big belly breathers and big neck breathers and get all of their expansion here, or they're just lifting their rib cage up all the time in order to get air in because they can't get expansion where they need expansion. We'll start to run into problems there because they'll start to develop a really stiff, really immobile rib cage that sets that shoulder blade up for success or for failure. So the shoulder blade then can't move very well on the rib cage, and the shoulder can't move very well on the shoulder blade, and you just start to see this chain link of problems. And those problems can't necessarily just be dealt with by just looking at the shoulder. You then have to look at the shoulder blade and at the rib cage too. So if you suspect that you may have an underlying problem with the rib cage or with the shoulder blade, which is common, you can check out the classes in the human infrastructure section, specifically the thoracic spine, rib cage, and scapula class, so that's the bonus human infrastructure class, and the upper body human infrastructure classes. There's rib cage, shoulder blade, and shoulder elements built into each of those classes. You can also go down to the kin stretch class section, go to the joint specific classes, and you'll have specific classes for the shoulder blade and specific classes for the thoracic spine and rib cage there too. And of course that is in addition to the many classes for the shoulder in the kin stretch library as well, and you'll see those broken down into internal rotation, external rotation, and then each one of your linear movements with progressions on those classes added for you too. As always, if you guys have any questions about that, do not hesitate to reach out. If you need a little extra guidance, I'm happy to talk to you guys as well, as always. But remember that if you have a problem, you have an injury, I always recommend going to get that assessed.